Well, we are joined now by Bears beat reporter for the Chicago Tribune, Dan Wiederer. As you can tell, he's in Palm Beach just chilling at the Breakers all week. We were just saying what a great assignment. And I got to ask, was the party fun last night?
Oh, the Monday night reception at the owners' meetings is one of the highlights of the year. Really, really good time. Yeah, it's always good to eat some of that good food and drink some of that good drink that the NFL allows you to have at these meetings.
Yeah, let's bring that back to Soldier Field. Let's start with the hot topic. Tabling the tush-push vote until a later date. Sounds like it'll be in May, and it sounds like it's split down the middle. What's the buzz around the tush-push down in West Palm?
Yeah, the sentiment is that the discussions were very spirited inside the rooms this week as people try to get their arms around what exactly is being debated. There is some gray area for some folks on figuring out if we start to legislate the tush push out of the game, then how does that affect blocking down the field? Where do you draw the line? Where do the officials have to be most concerned about it? There's a health and safety component here that gets introduced that then complicates things, but you do get a groundswell of people that say, listen, the Eagles and the Bills just do this better than other teams, and it's always been the philosophy of this league to try to find ways to stop what other teams do well. And eventually someone will, or the Eagles will get worse players. And all of a sudden, this will not be as big of an issue as it is now. So there's a lot of people that say, just leave it alone. Let it be. Let's see who can come up with the best way to stop it first. But as you said, it's tabled, and they will revisit the discussion in May and try to figure out what changes need to be made, if any at all.
I want to go to something that Ben Johnson was talking about this morning, because you had breakfast with Ben essentially for 30 minutes. You got to ask him all those questions. And the thing that came out of it was this talk about how he views analytics, and the most important one being EPA, or expected points added. And he specified that being in the passing game. First off, for people who are like, what in the world does that mean? You know, I was listening to the Pat McAfee show, and he's like, it's kind of like plus minus in basketball, how much you're helping your team. Is that how you understand it as well?
Well, and I talked to Ryan Poles this afternoon and said, look, like we all just became students of EPA as of 8:30 Florida time this morning. And it is something that's very important to Ben. We heard him, Cassie, introduce this at his introductory press conference in regards to quarterback play being the defining factor on what distinguishes winning teams from losing teams, and winning games from losing games. And so along with that, the most important metric to Ben is this EPA. And so the Bears are going to try to find a formula that gets them on the right side of this. Some of what goes into that is creating explosive plays through run after the catch. Ben was very direct in saying, look, like we have to be able to be an offense that, one, has balance, two, establishes a running game, but then uses that to unlock these explosive plays with run after the catch. You go watch some of the highlight reels of the Detroit Lions from 2023 and 2024, and you see a lot of that. And so Bears fans should get ready for that to be a component of the offense. What that requires is more under center action from Caleb Williams. It requires shorter routes at times. There's a lot that's going to go into building this playbook to unlock the EPA that the Bears are desiring. And now that process will begin here very soon. But at least we have a little bit of a bullseye here of what Ben's after.
Yeah, and why do you think Bears fans are eating this up so much? Is it because they're coming from Matt Eberflus, who was like, it's turnovers, it's turnover margin, and that clearly didn't translate into wins? And they're kind of nerding out over this new modern school of thought that Ben Johnson is bringing here, because you look on Twitter and it's like, oh my gosh, this guy gets it. And I don't know that anyone knows, like, for sure exactly what it is.
I think part of it is that anytime there's a new coach and the hope is starting to mushroom, that people just gravitate toward whatever they're selling. And so I think that's part of this right now. But I will say this, and I've confessed to this in multiple forums now, that the infectious energy that Ben brings is really, really confidence building for a building, you know? And so I think the Bears are feeling that inside Halas Hall. And even I felt it my first opportunity to sit down with him one-on-one. I know you've done that a couple times here since he was hired. You just feel that charisma and that communication skill that just creates an energy, right? And so like it's just new, it's different. And you're like, okay, let's see where Ben Johnson can take this whole thing, because there is something there. And to that end, I think Ryan Poles feels revitalized. I feel like he is carrying himself with a vibrance and sort of a reset that has him very energized, not only with what the Bears accomplished in March, but now what they can do in April in the draft, and then with Ben's energy setting the tone and creating the direction, that they can get this thing going much more quickly than they had the opportunity to do so 3 years ago when they had the last regime change.
All right, I want to go back to something you were talking about with this passing game that we're going to see under Ben Johnson and yards after the catch. They have one of the best in DJ Moore, who can create those opportunities and get those big chunk plays after he catches the ball. The question is, will he be playing that inside receiver role that we saw Amon-Ra St. Brown play in Detroit? Do you think that DJ Moore can handle that role and he will be that guy?
So this is going to be a trial and error thing for Ben to figure out if it needs to be one guy, if it can be a combination of all the guys they have. You know, they believe that Rome Odunze can play inside in the slot. He's also a guy, obviously, that we know can make those contested catches down the field. They signed Olamide Zaccheaus, right, in free agency to be a weapon for them offensively. And so it became very apparent this week that Ben really believes in the production of the slot receiver being a total catalyst to where an offense needs to go. And so they're going to have to figure out a way to unlock that. It's important to remember that as much excitement has built since the end of January, Ben Johnson has yet to hold a practice at House Hall. He's yet to have a team meeting at House Hall, and some of that will start as early as next week, but there's a long way to go to start building an identity, building a playbook, figuring out who fits where. And so I think that process is going to be very demanding, but it's one the Bears are obviously looking forward to.
All right, you talked about being able to finally get that first team meeting that they're going to have next week, and Ben Johnson admitted he's kind of a procrastinator, which honestly kind of surprised me. But he said he's going to formulate his message to the team sometime over this weekend. Going back to last year where the message clearly did not resonate with the team with Matt Eberflus, what do you feel like are the important points Ben Johnson needs to hit on as he stands in front of his team now for the first time?
Well, first of all, I told our mutual friend Kevin Fishman that I look forward to reading the Athletics story on Ben Johnson being a procrastinator. It'll be a great deep dive on how the Bears missed on this coach because they didn't realize that he didn't do things until the last minute. All kidding aside, I think Ben is very, very adamant about setting very clear standards, very clear direction, and making sure that those are adhered to. We talked in January about this buzzword of accountability that players were asking for, that the front office said needed to be better going forward. And a lot of that really comes back to consequence for when things aren't done right, and making sure that you hit on those things and you make sure that everybody in the building knows what the bar is. And if it's not cleared, you go back and you make sure you clear it. And so it's easy to say those things. It's easy to message those in front of a team. It's much harder to enforce them. And that's going to be the challenge for Ben Johnson and his coaching staff. I do think that he told us this morning that among the coaches on staff, he feels like Eric Bieniemy, Antoine Randall, and El Harris are sort of practice field enforcers, guys that will be heard, guys that will be felt, and guys that can kind of create that tone and that standard that needs to be had when you're practicing. And so all of these things go into building sort of a winning environment and a winning atmosphere. And you can't leave any of those ignored, because otherwise you leave yourself exposed. And the Bears have been exposed for far too long, as you know, and they've got to find a way to create some consistent success.
Yeah, when it comes to the way Ben Johnson's going to coach Caleb Williams, how do you think Caleb is going to react to that? Because we hear about the intensity he brings. Dan Miller, the voice of the Detroit Lions, was saying he's seen him go after players in practice when they are not practicing up to his standard. And Caleb Williams went from Shane Waldron, who I'm not quite sure ever addressed anything with him, to Thomas Brown, who tried to get a little bit more out of him and was a little bit more, I want to say, confrontational in how he coached Caleb Williams. So how do you think that relationship is going to work together as they continue to get to know each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. In a side session I had this afternoon with Ryan Poles, I asked him, in the short term, what's the most important part of this process between Caleb Williams and Ben Johnson? And he said it's really all about establishing trust. Month of April, month of May, you've got to get on the same page. You've got to connect. You've got to see the game through each other's eyes. And most importantly, you have to have trust in one another. And once you establish that trust, and once Caleb believes that Ben has the answers to take his career to where it needs to go, he'll be bought in. And that trust and that buy-in create, sort of that momentum that is needed for a quarterback to get going, that obviously was lacking in 2024. And so it'll be interesting to see how they find their way down that path. It's going to be new for both of them to be working with one another and trying to figure out which buttons you can push and which ones you should stay away from. And so, again, there's a lot of trial and error ahead for Ben and his coaching staff to figure out what works and what doesn't with the players that they have. And Caleb's the most important of the group. Obviously, the Bears are going to design their spring around trying to get Caleb comfortable so that when he walks into training camp in late July, he's ready to roll, and the Bears can get on that on-ramp toward the regular season feeling like they can be successful this year, because that has been a constant talking point of Ben Johnson and this staff, is that, we don't have to wait 2 or 3 years to feel like we can be very competitive in this league and in this division. It's got to start right now in April and May and building those relationships.
Yeah, and I got to imagine that Caleb Williams walking into Hallis Hall next week, meeting with Ben Johnson for the first time, in the meeting room, watching film, whatever they plan on doing, has to feel very confident about what they built in front of him on that offensive line. Now, you're wondering what the left tackle position might look like, but it seemed like Ben Johnson had some good things to say about Braxton Jones today, and even complimentary of Kuran Amagaji and his untapped potential.
I think the Bears have their mind open to exploring this draft later this month, figuring out what's available to them at the offensive tackle position. If they don't get a premium player that can come in and compete for a starting job, then they're going to have to try to figure out what to do with Braxton Jones, who may still be limited by the time training camp starts in July after that season-ending injury late last year. Ben Johnson kind of referred to Karan Amagaji as a developmental player who obviously had a slow start as a rookie and didn't get on the field, even on the practice field, until very late in his first year. And so they've got a lot to figure out there. As much as they address the interior of the offensive line, I think there are still some question marks at the left tackle position. And some of those will get answered here in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And whether it's plan A, plan B, or plan C, the Bears will walk into rookie camp, or at least the first set of OTAs, feeling like they know what they have and they need to know how to work around it.
All right, Dan, I want to go back because you were on the show a month ago and we asked you if it were the draft, who would you be taking? Who are your top 5 picks? You gave us 6. I'm only going to go through the top 3 because you went Mason Graham, then Will Campbell, and your third was Ashton Jeanty. And that was before all of the trades and free agency happened. So now that all has unfolded, do you still like your list, or are you wanting to make any amendments to it?
I'm stubborn, so I like my list, and I'm going to stick with it. I do think that the Jeanty discussion is interesting, and you and I talked from the outset that the conversation itself should be had. It's fun to have, and you can figure out what it looks like in terms of the depth at the position, the opportunity cost of taking a running back at number 10, and what that looks like. But I think when you give Ben Johnson the opportunity to look at offensive weapons and skill players and try to figure out which ones unlock his creativity and his imagination most, you have to consider those things. Mason Graham, another guy that I said, if he falls to number 10, if I'm Ryan Poles, I'm quick to pull that trigger. Even if he's at number 8, I might consider calling and offering up a pick to go up and get him, because I think that's a guy that plugs in to your defensive line on day one and becomes a long-term starter and an impact player for you. And so that list is pretty good. And we talked a month ago about how appealing this menu was going to be when the Bears go on the clock at number 10. I still feel that way. They're going to have a lot of good choices that can be seen as right when they make them. And then again, they've got 3 picks on Friday of draft weekend, and those 3 picks are really, really valuable in a draft that feels like it's got what the Bears need at the positions they need it at in that middle to the second and third round there on Friday. And so they've got to put together a collection of 4 guys in the top 75 that they feel really strongly about. And however that comes together will be really interesting to watch.
All right, I got to go back to Ashton Jeanty because he seems to be the one player that everyone loves listening to content about. Because I don't know, do you feel like maybe Ryan Poles, as the general manager, because from what we know, he is in the final year of his contract, is in a position to take a swing at him right now because of the moves he's made in free agency and pulling off those 2 trades? Or does he still need to play it safe?
No, again, if you can find a guy that you think is a major difference maker, you go ahead and you go after it. And so the Jeanty conversation is fun because, look, like you and I and every fan in Chicago would much rather watch tape of a guy breaking off 60-yard runs than measuring Will Campbell's arm length, right? Like, it's just more interesting to look at the explosion of a running back that's played at a high level than it is to watch offensive tackle film. But the Bears just have to be right at number 10. You have to get a guy that you look back on 5 or 6 years from now and say, I have no regrets making that selection, whether it works out or not. Jeanty certainly seems like he projects as a guy who's going to be a big-time difference maker in this league, no matter where he lands. And so he's on the table for sure. And then you have to figure out what the depth of that position looks like. And do you feel like there are options almost as good that you could take in the second round and play that game a little bit with the puzzle you're putting together? But I think everything is there for Ryan Poles, and whatever they decide to do on the first night of the draft is going to be done with conviction. It's going to be done with a sense that it builds this team both for the short term and the long term future.
If you're Ryan Poles and you have the 10th overall pick, are you looking at trading down, or do you feel like there are so many good players at the top of that board that you want to take one at 10?
Well, I'll take calls. If someone wants to come up, whether that's for a Jeanty, whether it's for a quarterback that may slip to number 10, like, I'll entertain the calls. I just want to know that what I'm getting back to move out of that slot is going to allow me to create that momentum with the entire draft class. This draft class, we're going to look back on this 5 years from now and say this was huge for the Bears, one way or another, whether they hit on it or whether they totally whiff on it. This is a big moment in the franchise's history, and so they've got to come out of draft weekend with a draft class that does what the draft class of Brad Holmes have done in Detroit, which is turn a team that was in last place and floundering into a 2-time division champ. And so this is a big moment here in this month with the staffs of Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles getting together and finalizing that draft board is huge toward creating the decision-making processes that will play out on the last weekend of April. And so they've got to get this right, because Cassie, you and I have lived through too many draft classes that have fizzled, and then you look at where the Bears are, constantly rebooting, constantly trying to fill holes that they thought they had filled previously, and it's all a big mess.
All right, Dan, appreciate you coming on the off season. Safe travels back to Chicago, but enjoy the sun while you're still there.
Yeah, I may not come back, but thanks for having me.
Yeah. We also learned from Kevin Warren and George McCaskey there's a shift in tone when it comes to the stadium. They're now focused on both Arlington Heights and the lakefront, citing Arlington being ready for construction with a metro stop and somewhere George Halas identified as a good place for a stadium more than 50 years ago.